there's the new minivan. It's pretty sweet. What is that? Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god.
What's up guys, Joey here, and welcome to a two-part series from PremiumBeat.com. This is going to be an awesome tutorial series where we're going to show you how to create a giant city-sized UFO and have it hover and terrorize your town. All of the music and sound effects that I used in the trailer for this tutorial came from PremiumBeat.com. They are an amazing music and sound effects resource. So if you haven't checked them out yet, definitely check out their website. Now in part one, we're gonna go into Cinema 4D and we're gonna model, texture, light, render, and talk about a whole bunch of other things to create a realistic UFO. So let's hop in and get started. So to get to this result, there's a bunch of steps that it takes, and I'm going to walk you through each one by one because I don't want to just show you like a recipe how to make a UFO, because what use is that? I want to teach you guys how to think about how to approach something like this. So first of all, if you're going to be making a UFO, you have to have some kind of design for that UFO. You need to know what it's going to look like, right? And so whenever I have to design absolutely anything, I just pull reference, okay? So first thing I'm gonna do is just pop into my good old friend Google, and I'm just gonna type in UFO or UFO spaceship that popped up, and I'm gonna go to Google image search, okay? And what I'm looking for, because you can see that there's, you know, 1,000,001 different ways a UFO can look, and most of them are kind of like this flying saucer shape, but there's like a lot of different, you know, some aren't very good, some are really good, some are, you know, this is from District 9 and obviously looks amazing. And this is kind of the vibe I wanted to go for. I wanted this mammoth looking thing hovering over, you know, my neighborhood, and I wanted it to look absolutely gigantic. And so this actually is one of the reference images I used to try and figure this out. Now, the detail in this model and the model of this spaceship is incredible, and I knew I wasn't going to have time to do something like that. So I wanted to find like a simpler kind of design, and this image is actually one I really liked because it's a simple shape, but I like that there's some kind of glowing lights going on, and it just really kind of struck me. All right, so what I did was I actually saved this image to my hard drive. All right, and I could just say save image as, and we're gonna pop into my little project folder here, and I'm gonna make a new folder, and I'm just gonna call this reference, okay? And so let's just save that image in there. And let's see what else. You know, one of the other things that I kind of wanted to get was just a subtle kind of speaker, you know, shape. Because this is for PremiumBeat.com, I thought that might be a nice little touch. So if we type in speaker, then you can see that there's lots and lots of reference images of speakers, and I really just wanted to get a sense of, you know, how big the middle part needs to be, and then how big the next part, and just have something to reference. And maybe what, you know, I was also looking for some other details I could add, you know, like there's a coil in here, there's a nice mesh on this, so, you know, here's another good image. So let me just save this as, I'll just save that as speaker in my reference folder, okay? And there's one other thing that I want to point out before we get going too far, and that is, let's go back to our UFO spaceship images here. One of the things that's very, very important when you want something to look big is to know how to make things look big, right? You know, for example, I don't know, if we look at this, okay? This image does not, let's jump back here. This image doesn't strike me as a big thing, right? This looks very small, and not just because the image is small, but because there's no scale to it. Look at this image. Here's another good example, right? There's nothing in this image that tells me how big this is except for the water, the surface of the water. And, you know, looking at the surface of the water, this makes me think that this flying saucer, I don't know, maybe it's 10 feet across or something. And because your brain is going to take whatever details it can, and it's going to use that to try and figure out the scale of that object, okay? And so if you look at the one I've done here, the main trick I used was using a very detailed texture. And then there's some compositing tricks too to make it look big. But what you want to make sure you don't do is just have a smooth surface that doesn't give you anything to really latch onto for scale. And one of the ways we're going to do that is by using something called a greeble. And if you're not familiar with what a greeble is just sort of a meaningless detail added to a surface. And these are some of the most famous greebles in history. All that detail all over the Death Star they're just there to make it look humongous, right? Because your brain assumes, oh, there's this tiny little thing here, and these little details are covering this, so this must be a massive thing, right? And Star Wars actually is famous for greebles. I think that might even be where the word came from. All right, so enough of that. We've got our reference. Now let's make a new Cinema 4D project, and let's get started. So when I have a reference, picture that I want to look at inside of Cinema 4D, what I do is I open up a picture viewer, and then you can go File, Open, and you can actually open your reference. Okay, so let me open up this, and now I've got this image, and I can actually grab right here where these little dots are, and I can dock this, and maybe I'll just dock it over here. Okay, let's see here. Didn't do it right. Let's try that again. There we go. All right, so I docked my picture viewer over on the right side, and so now I can just sort of, glance over and make sure that, the model I'm creating kind of has the same proportions as this. So we are going to start with just a primitive, but we are going to get into the modeling tools, which I'm hoping that's something that not a lot of you have a ton of experience with, because Cinema 4D makes it so easy to model things without actually knowing how to model, but we are going to use some of those tools for this. So we are going to start with let's start with a cylinder, all right? And first thing I want to do is just get the general proportions correct. And I'm going to move my camera so I'm underneath this thing, because I know that that's pretty much the angle I'm going to be seeing it from. All right, this thing's flying up in the air, so we're going to be down here underneath it. All right, and I just want to roughly get the proportions correct. It's not super important, but having this image over here makes it easy. I'm not gonna make something like this, right? Because it's easy to see, well, that doesn't work. That's not what I want. So you can either use the interactive controls or use the properties over here. I want that nice roundness, right, on the sides. So I'm going to turn on the caps and fillet those caps, and then adjust the radius, all right, until I get a nice smooth curve like that. Now here's something that's really important. I know that in order to get these, concentric circles and get all that detail in there, I'm going to need to model this thing. And because I'm going to be modeling it, it's very, very important that I can see the polygons of this object so I can sort of see what I'm going to be working with. So it's always a good idea to switch your display from the default GoRod, I don't know how you say that, switch it from that to the one right below it. So now you can actually see the polygon lines, okay? And if you hit render really quickly, a good thing to look at is look at the contour of the image, right? It looks very smooth on the inside, and that's because we've got this Phong tag on our object, which sort of smooths out the shading, but there's not very many subdivisions around the edge of this, right? So if I look at it, you can actually see, especially if I get in close here, you can see these hard edges. And when we render this for real, we are gonna see those, so I wanna make sure I have enough detail in there. So I'm gonna go to the Object tab and up the rotation segments, and I'll just make it 64. All right, and now that should work better. Okay, now it's gonna be far away, it's probably never gonna be bigger than this in the frame. So I don't need it to be, a crazy amount of detail, but I do want to make sure there's enough. All right, so now let's go back to our picture viewer and let's see what else. Okay, so, one thing I'm noticing is that this looks very, very smooth and flat, and it looks, a lot like a coin or something. This, it's got a lot more kind of a pointiness to it in the middle. So I actually want to change the shape of this thing, all right? And this is where we really are going to get into some modeling. So first thing I need to do is, if I'm going to model this thing, I need to convert it into a polygon object. You can do that by hitting the C key, or you can come up here and hit this button too, and it will, if you kind of hover your mouse over it, it should tell you, if you look down here, it'll tell you what it does. Converts a parametric object into a polygon object, so now you can model it. So first thing I want to do is I want to try and stretch it out a little bit so that it's got that pointier middle like our reference does. All right, so I'm going to kind of move quickly through these modeling tools. So I'm going to turn on the screen capture feature where you can see what buttons I'm pushing, and I'll talk through it. But I'm going to move fast because we got a lot to get through. So I'm going to switch to edge mode so I can select the edges here, and I'm going to hit U, which brings up a menu that shows me all of the commands that have to do with selecting, and there's also some modeling commands in there. And if you hit U and then another letter, and you got to make sure you don't move the mouse because then the menu goes away. So you hit U, and now I'm going to hit L. And if you look really quickly, L is for loop selection. And this is going to let me quickly select loops like this. So I'm going to select this middle loop here, okay? Now, with that selected, I can hit T to switch to scale mode, and I can just scale that edge out. Now, that's cool, but I don't want it to just scale that edge out. I want it to scale all of the edges, but this edge the most. So there's a cool thing you can do in Cinema 4D where you select something, right? And with it selected, so let me go back to my loop selection tool, UL, okay? And I'm going to select it. And now I can switch to my normal selection tool. You can just hit spacebar and it'll switch back to that. And now where it says mode normal, let's switch that to soft selection, okay? And what soft selection does is it lets you select something, but then it will automatically select things around your selection based on these settings, okay? So right now the mode is group. I'm going to switch that to all. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow absolutely any edge to be selected. And you can see sort of that the part around the edge that's selected is a little bit more yellow than the rest of it. So let me mess with some of the settings. Here's the radius of the soft selection, and this is sort of the distance from your initial selection that will actually be selected. So now that I've lowered this to 28 centimeters, you can see that none of this is selected. This is selected all the way, and then it's sort of creating this gradient of selectiveness along the edge of this thing. So soft selection is an incredibly powerful modeling tool, and now whatever I do to this edge will be done to the other edges proportionally with how much they're selected. So just by getting a nice soft selection and scaling it, I've managed to get something that's more like that, okay? So let's take a look at it from underneath, and that looks much better. Scale it a little bit more. I could even move it. I could move it up and watch what happens. It's gonna move the other edges up, but just a little bit, not as much. So you can get this sort of, I don't know, like a Reese's peanut butter cup shape, all right? Pretty cool. So now we've got the bottom of this thing. And so now looking at this, right, if we're underneath this thing, I can't really see the top at all. And I might want to see the top a little bit more. So now I'm going to use another selection tool, all right? Well, actually, maybe I'll just still do another soft selection. I'm going to switch to polygon mode. And I'm going to switch to my selection tool. And I'm just going to quickly select like this, all of these polygons. Then I'm going to up the soft selection. Okay, and I want to select everything up until about this edge here. So now when I pull this up, right, you can see what it does. It pulls everything up, and I need to move this down a little bit more. But it's going to move these polygons the most, okay? So I can really dial in that shape I want. There's a lot more settings here. I'm not going to get into them too much, but that's the basics of soft selection. Cool, okay? So now this is our base shape, okay? Now let's talk about getting some of these cool details in here. Now, like for example, there's this cool blue light that goes around the top of our reference. And so let's say that I decided within this row of polygons here, I want to put like a cut inside there and have the inside of that cut be lit up. Okay, well, how do we do that? So what we're going to do is switch to polygon mode, and what we're going to do is we want to select all of these polygons, right? This row right here. I don't want soft selection on anymore, so I'm going to set that mode on the live selection tool to normal, and I want to select that ring of polygons. You can do the same thing we did, loop selection on an edge. You can do it with polygons. So we're going to hit U and L, bring up our loop tool, grab that loop. Okay, and you can see that it's alternating between grabbing a loop that goes this way and a loop that goes sideways, and it just depends what edge you're closest to. Okay, so if you're closest to one of these edges, it will select that loop, and if you're closest to one of these sort of horizontal edges, then it's going to select a loop that goes into Z. So now we've got that loop of polygons selected. Now we're going to use a couple modeling tools. I'm going to hit M, which brings up another contextual menu of modeling tools. And we're going to use extrude inner, which is W. Extrude is one of the most common modeling operations you can do in 3D software. And an extrude inner works kind of the same way, except, and actually this might be easier to show you guys just very quickly in a new scene here. If I make a cube and hit C to make it into a polygon object, and then I select all of the faces of it, and I hit M to bring up my modeling tools, and then I hit T to extrude, right? This is what extrude does. It takes a polygon and it extrudes it out and creates new geometry where it moves through. Extrude inner, MW, extrudes inside the polygons, okay? And then you could extrude those and you can create these really cool complex shapes this way, okay? So back to our UFO, I'm gonna do an extrude inner, MW. We're gonna extrude inwards, and you can see what it does. It creates a new set of polygons, and I can make them as thin as I want. I'm literally just clicking and dragging interactively. All right, this is fantastic. Now, I've got a nice thin edge. Let's zoom in a little bit. Now I'm gonna hit MT, and now I'm going to extrude these, okay? So what extrude is going to do, if I click and drag, you'll see it will extrude out like that, or it will extrude in, and in is what I want. I want to create a little inset in there, just like that, okay? Now, you can see that the angle that this is coming out at is basically perpendicular to the normal, or which direction this polygon is facing, okay? And if that's not what you want, you can change that by changing the edge angle here, but this is actually exactly what I want. So, and you do need to be careful that you don't extrude and then say, oh, I want to adjust it and do this again, because now you're doing two extrusions. All right, so undo if you don't get what you want. I want it to just go in a little bit like that, and that's good to go. And now another thing we need to worry about is these edges here, right? Now the edge that kind of goes up into the spaceship, it's a super duper hard edge. If we just do a quick render, you can see a very hard edge. So maybe we want to soften that a little bit. So if we go back into edge mode and hit UL, right, loop selection, I can grab that edge, and then I can hold shift and grab that edge. And I can use another modeling tool, so hit M, and we're going to select the bevel tool, which is S. So M, then S is bevel. And then you can click and drag interactively, and it's going to soften out that edge a little bit. Now, it's not giving me a lot of detail there, but what you can do is you can kind of get it started, and then come over here to the tools, and you can interactively adjust those. So if I up the subdivision, you can see it adds more edges in there, and it makes it softer. Okay, so with a subdivision of 4, it adds 4 levels, and now I've got this nice soft kind of roundness to it. Cool. All right. So now what I want to do is let's talk about getting something like this in the middle here. Okay. So what I want to do is kind of get something that resembles a speaker. So I sort of want like a big hole here, and then inside the hole, I want to have some more stuff happening. So what I'm going to do is go to polygon mode. I'm going to grab all these polygons. I'm also going to hit Option D, and that temporarily disables that axis that pops up. It just gets it out of the way visually, makes it a little bit easier to see. I'm going to hit MW, right, to bring in my inner extrude tool. And I'm just gonna move it in a little bit, and then hit MT and extrude this thing up like this. And you can see if I go too far, it goes through the top of the UFO. So that's too far. So let's just do that, okay? And then UL, switch to edge mode, grab that edge, and then hit MS. Remember, this is all stuff we've done already, the bevel tool, and we'll bevel that edge a little bit, okay? There you go. So now we've got this cool UFO with a big hole in the middle, and it's fantastic. And now we can fill in that middle with, you know, some more detail and try to make like a little speaker type of thing, okay? So why don't we just start with another cylinder, and before we get too far, let me make sure I name this correctly. So this is UFO main. Cool. And then we're going to add another cylinder. And we're just going to do pretty much the same steps we just did. We're going to scale it up, right? So it's roughly the right size. And this can be inset inside of this UFO a little bit. I'm going to up the segments to 64, so we get a lot of detail. And then I'm just going to hit C, turn it into a polygon object. And now what I want to do is pull up the reference of my speaker. So now in my picture viewer, I'm going to open up my speaker image, and I'm going to hit H, which is just going to fill my frame with it. And now I can just kind of look at this and figure out what little details I want to pull out, okay? So I like this outer edge here, so let me pull that out. So I'm going to go to polygon mode, select all these, and I'm going to do a quick extrude inner, so MW, right? Just like that. And then I'm going to do MT, extrude. I'm going to push it in a little bit, okay? And it doesn't have to be too far. And then, let's see. Then let's do another extrude inner, just a little bit. And then another extrude, MT, and pull it back out. Now this is going to look a little bit different than the one I have in my demo, but that's okay. So now I've modeled this edge and then this little divot, and now we've got this part where it's kind of poofy. So let's do an extrude inner like this, okay? And what I need to do is add a bunch of subdivisions in here because I want it to end up looking poofy like this. And I can't do that if I've only got an edge here and an edge here. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've done my inner extrude, I can come over to the options and interactively add more edges. And I'm going to add 5. I'm going to set that number to 5 so that there is one in the middle, right, that I can select. And let me actually do a few more subdivisions there. As long as you get an odd number of subdivisions, you will have one edge that's in the middle, and then we'll select it, do a soft selection, and pull it up, and we'll get that nice poof. All right, so let's not worry about that yet, though. So now we've got our poof. We've got one more little kind of section here, so I'm going to do another extrude inner, okay? And this time I want to set the subdivision down to 1, okay? And I want this one to kind of angle in a little bit. So actually, with all of these selected now, I'm going to hit E, which brings up my move tool, and I'm going to hit Option D to bring back that axis, and I'm just going to push it up a little bit, like that. All right, so I'm actually just shaping this thing. And then I'm going to do another extrude inner, and go to about there, and I'm going to push this one up a little bit too. And now this section here, that's going to be this poofy section, okay? That's going to be this big kind of central cone thing. So I'm going to do an extrude inner, and I'm going to extrude this way into the middle, and then I'm going to up the subdivision to some odd number, let's say 9. Okay, so now I can start shaping the pieces I need to. So I've already got this selected. So with that selected, why don't I go to my selection tool, turn on soft selection, and I can up the radius a little bit. And then I can drag this down like this and create that extruded kind of cone thing. Now if you look, it's dragging it down in this very linear way. And this is this nice pillowy looking, kind of shape. So what I'm going to do, I'm just hitting undo a couple times, is I'm going to go to my soft selection settings, and I'm going to change fall off from linear, which makes a linear shape like that, to dome. And now it's going to give me this nice round shape. And you can play with the settings to get it exactly the way you want, but that's pretty good. Okay. Now one other thing I want to talk about really quickly. If I render this right now, you see how it looks very smooth in there? Like you're not seeing those nice hard edges like you kind of do here. What could be causing that is this Phong tag. The Phong tag looks at the angle between all your polygons, and if it's below a certain threshold, it just smooths it. And by default, the Phong angle is set to 80, which is very smooth. So I usually set that to something like 30, and it'll let you see a little bit more detail. You can even set it lower than that. And now you can you'll start to see every single polygon, so that might be too much. But you can adjust that to get more or less of a hardness, right? That looks more like what I want, actually. All right, so the next thing is this piece here, right? This nice poofy piece right there. I want to get that. So let me select that object, and I'm going to call this inner UFO. Cool, and we're going to go into edge mode, select that center loop. Right, the very center loop, which is that one. And then I'm going to go and do, I'm going to just hit spacebar to go back to my selection tool. And I'm going to adjust my soft selection so I'm only hitting those polygons. And then I'm going to pull this down like that, right? And so now you can see I've got that nice poofy shape. Perfect, okay? And there we go. So now I've got this cool base UFO shape. And, we're going to texture it. We're going to do a lot of things to it also. But I also want to talk a little bit about those greebles, okay? So right now, this could be an enormous city-sized spaceship, or it could be something the size of a car, or it could be something the size of a headphone, right? It's impossible to tell. And so, you know, doing the little greeble trick, right, putting tons of detail in there is one way to give things a lot of scale. So I use a very cheap trick to do this on the demo, and this is how I did it. So I took a cube, and you make it very small. Make it like 1 by 1 by 1, really, really tiny. And then add a cloner, put the cube in the cloner. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna clone that cube all over the main part of this UFO, but we don't wanna clone it over every single part. We really only want it on, you know, the main pieces that we can see. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to loop selection in polygon mode. So UL, and then I am just going to I'm gonna zoom in here, and I'm gonna select that loop, and holding shift, I'm just gonna select a whole bunch of loops like this. Only ones that we really can see. Just like that, okay? And then with those polygons selected, I'm gonna go up to select and say set selection. This is gonna create a little triangle tag on that object called a polygon selection. And now I'm gonna rename that for greebles. All right, and what this is gonna let me do is clone the cube all over that UFO, but only where I selected. So it's not gonna clone up in that little part there. It's not gonna clone on the inside that we can't really see. It's not gonna clone on the top that we can't see, only where we want it. Okay, so let's go to the cloner. Let's set that to object mode, and we're gonna clone onto the main UFO object. And down here where it says selection, I'm gonna drag that selection. And there you go. Now you can see that cube has been cloned, but only on the parts that we want. Now, right now, it's being cloned onto each vertex. So it looks very organized, and that's not what I want. I actually want it to be on the surface, and I'm gonna crank that number up to like some really high number. Let's try like 2,500, okay? And now you're getting a lot of little cubes all over the surface of it, and even just doing that, it adds a ton of detail that tells your brain this thing is much bigger, you know, than things around it, right? Because if these things are on there and you see them, well, they must be tiny. This thing must be massive, right? You're tricking your brain. I also want to make sure that I have render instances turned on, because we're going to have so many clones here that we want to sort of maximize our memory usage. And turning on render instances is going to speed up renders and make things work better. And since these greebles aren't going to be moving or anything, and actually let me rename this greebles, that's going to work out great. Cool. All right, so let's actually up that number. Let's make that 4,500. And then with my cloner selected, I'm going to grab a random effector. And I'm going to have it not randomize position, but randomize scale. And I want the X to be randomized a lot. The Y could be randomized a little bit, and then the Z can be randomized even more. And just by doing that, you've got all of this surface detail all over your UFO. All right, so this is a super easy way to add quote greebles. And if you wanted to, you could actually build 2 or 3 variations, and one is a cube and one is a sphere, and you could model things and use MoGraph to just clone them all over your spaceship. Cool. So that's a way of adding greebles. And one thing that you can see that, you know, it's still moving pretty quickly because these are just cubes. But a little trick I like to do is to just disable the greebles in the viewport so that I can really move around quickly. But leave that bottom traffic light left alone so that when you render, they do show up. Cool. And then the last thing I want to do is I'm going to take that inner UFO shape that I made, and I'm going to copy it, and we're going to call this small speaker, and I'm going to go into object mode, and I'm just going to scale this thing way down like this. And what I want to do is take that shape and clone it all over the UFO, and maybe put them on the inside here, or maybe put them on the outside of this ring, because I just want to add more detail, but I don't want to model anything else. I've already modeled enough. So what I'm going to do is let me zero out the coordinates for this real quick, and we're going to take this and put this in its own cloner. All right, so we'll grab a cloner, and and we'll call this speakers. Put the small speaker in there. And we're going to set the cloner mode from linear to radial. And we're going to expand that radius out. And you can see that it's creating a radial clone array here, not in the right, orientation. We actually want that on the XZ plane. And now we can't see them because they're inside our UFO. So let's move the whole thing down. And let's figure out where we want these. We could put them around maybe on this poofy ring, but that might be weird. You might see them better if they were like sticking out of the side of this thing. So maybe we'll do that. So I'm going to grab my speaker that's inside of my cloner. And actually the easier way, go into your cloner, go to the transform tab, and this will let you transform all of your clones equally. And let's just pitch them 90 degrees. All right, and let's go into our top view here. And so this, let's see here. I'm trying to orient myself. It might be easier to just do in this view. What I want to do is I want to make more of these, so I'm going to up the count. Okay. I also want them smaller. They're too big right now. So you could adjust that in the transform tab, or you can just grab the speaker, hit T to go into scale mode, and just manually scale it down and make them maybe that big. And then let's move our cloner up like this. Okay, line that up where we want it, and then we'll add more clones until we've got a lot of these things around the edge. And now if we come back here, we take a look, now you've got more detail, and you've got greebles all over these things, and there's a lot going on. And what's also cool about having these is that now, let me just go ahead and group this entire thing. I'm going to select every piece of it, including the random effector, and hit Option G to group it. And this will be my UFO. And now I've got enough detail on there where when I rotate this, you'll be able to see that it's rotating, and those speakers, all around there are really going to help you do it. Cool. All right. So now we've got our base model, and we've added the greebles, and we've added some more detail. Now, how do we texture this thing? So texturing in Cinema 4D, unfortunately, is one of those things that I feel like a lot of people don't really understand. I'm sure all of you know how to make a material and apply it to an object. But when you're doing something like this, you really want total control. And so what you want to do is set up a UV map, okay? So that's the first thing we're going to do. I'm going to turn off my greebles, turn those totally off. And I'm going to turn off that inner UFO, and I'm going to turn off my speakers, and we're just going to focus on this, okay? Because once I show you how to UV and texture this, you'll know how to do it on the rest of this, okay? So here's what we're going to do. First thing we need to do is create a UV map for this. And a UV map, if you don't know, is a 2D representation of your object, sort of flattened out, that you can paint on and make your texture on, and then that UV map will get wrapped around your object in a way that you can specify. Now, one thing about UV maps is that they are 2D, and so if you have a 3D object like your UFO here, which has a totally seamless and continuous surface, there are no holes in it, right? So you're not actually going to be able to unfold that unless you tell Cinema 4D where to create an artificial hole. Now, we're a little bit lucky. We know we're going to be underneath this UFO, and we are not ever going to see the top of it. So to make our life a little easier, I'm just going to grab those polygons up here and make sure soft selection is off. And then with those selected, I'm just going to hit delete and delete those polygons. Cool? So now I've got a shape that has an opening, so now this can be flattened. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run the optimize command. Whenever you delete polygons, it deletes those polygons, but it doesn't delete those points. You can see there's a point there hovering in space, and that point is not attached to anything, and that can screw some things up. So whenever you delete polygons, it's a good idea to go up to the mesh menu, commands, and run the optimize command. It will get rid of any points that are not attached to anything, among other things, but that's one of the things it does. So now, let's switch our layout from startup to BP UV edits, okay? Now, over here, this area is your UV area, and this area has a relationship with your 3D model, which is defined by this checkerboard tag here called a UVW tag. So if I click on my object, and I come over here to UV mesh and say, show me the UV mesh, Well, this is the UV mesh currently for this object. And you're probably looking at this like I am and saying, I don't understand what I'm looking at. This makes no sense. I don't know which part, if I was saying, where is this polygon on this mesh? I have no idea. There's no correlation. So this isn't going to do us much good. If you don't understand why you need UV maps, there's another tutorial on School of Motion site called UV mapping in Cinema 4D. It will explain it. So watch that. So we're going to make a UV, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to go up here and we're going to switch into UV polygon mode. And we're going to come over here to the UV mapping tab and go to projection. Okay? And these are all sort of the starting point when you're doing UV mapping. One of my favorite ways of getting a good UV map is to go into one of these isometric views and find a good view, a good basic view of your object. In this case, the top is showing me the most, right? So I'm going to make sure I'm selecting my top view, because you can see I can actually select my front view or my right view. I want the top view selected, and then I'm going to hit frontal projection, and it's going to copy this view over here into my UV map. And then using my 4, 5, 6 keys, the same way you can move, rotate, and scale objects in this view, you can do it in this view. So 4 moves, 5 scales, 6 rotates, okay? So I'm going to just kind of center this. Now, right now, this might look like a good UV map, but what you're actually not seeing is that all of these polygons at the edge here, these are overlapping. And so if you have overlapping polygons on your UV map, you won't be able to get a good texture. All right, and just to prove it, I'm going to make a new material really quickly. I'm going to go to my materials browser, double click, make a new material. I'm going to hit this red X. That's going to load it into memory. And now I'm going to give it a color channel. So I'm going to double click this little X. All right, and I want a new 2K texture. So 20 by 48, 20 by 48. My background color can just be gray, and I'm going to name this UFO main text. Sorry, for texture. And not UFP, UFO. There we go. Hit OK. So now I have a texture, and I'm going to apply the texture to that object. So now I can grab my paintbrush. I can actually paint right on the UFO, which is great. See? Now, if I paint right on this, that looks great. Okay? The problem is, see how if I paint up here, it also shows up down here? I don't have independent control. Now, why is that? Well, if I paint a circle up here and we come over on our UV map and look, there is the circle on our UV map, and apparently that UV map is intersecting multiple polygons on our model. Okay, so we can't have overlapping polygons. It will not work. So there's some tools in Cinema 4D to fix that. You need to be in one of these UV modes, which are these checkerboard buttons up here. I usually use UV polygon mode. I'm going to hit Command A to select all my polygons, and then I'm going to go to Relax UV. All right, and what Relax UV does, if you hit Apply, is it attempts to unfold your object. And it may take a few seconds because there are a lot of polygons here, but what it's going to do is it's actually going to unfold this, okay? So now look at what it's given you. Okay, you can see that it's unfolded, nothing is intersecting. And here's how you check a UV map. Go into your layers, you have to have a material, have the material applied to the object, and then you can turn off the background, and it will create this cool checkerboard pattern, okay? And one of the things you're gonna see is, you're gonna see the checkerboard pattern applied across this whole object. And ideally, what you want is you want that checkerboard to be uniformly scaled across the whole thing. And it is for the most part, except if you look here, you can see how the checkerboards get smaller and smaller and smaller the more inward they go. That can be a problem because when you're painting on your UV map, things are going to get smaller and smaller on this part of the model, and they're going to be bigger on this part of the model. So we're going to just use another tool to sort of help get a more equalized kind of result. So I'm going to hit Command A, select all the polygons again, go to UV mapping, and in your optical mapping tab, select Realign, have all of these things checked. Preserve orientation, stress to fits, equalize island size, and hit Apply. And it's just going to adjust it ever so slightly. And if you had like a UV like this and you hit apply, it's going to scale it up to maximize the amount of real estate that you get on your UV map. And so now if we look at this, you're never going to get a perfect result, but this is better. When you have something that is not flat, right, and this is a 3D object that by definition is not flat, you're always going to have some distortion on your UV map, but this is going to work pretty well. And now, of course, the beauty is, if we go back to our layers and turn on our background, I can paint right on this, and I'm not going to get, let me actually grab a paintbrush so I can paint. I can paint right on this, and I can paint right on this, and you're never going to get any sort of overlapping polygons, right? Cool. And I'm not sure where that paint stroke ended up. It's somewhere. All right, so now what I want to do is actually create this texture and make it really cool, but be able to see it in 3D at the same time. And this is how you can use body paint, which is what this is all called inside of Cinema 4D. This is how you can use it to create super duper custom awesome textures. So what I need to do is first save out this texture that I have so I can open it in Photoshop, because Photoshop is a much better image editing tool. And so first thing I want to do is I want to delete these little circles. I'm going to turn off my UV mesh for a second, and I'm just going to make a gigantic brush here and paint over these, so I have nothing. I just have a blank background. And then what I'm going to do is go to my color tab, select, let's just select white as a color, and I'm going to go into one of my UV modes here and select all my polygons, and I'm going to say layer, create UV mesh layer. And what that does is it actually makes a bitmap layer of your UVs. And the reason you want to do that is so that you can go File, Save Texture As, and I'm going to save this as a Photoshop file. And let's save that. Let's make a new folder, and we'll just call it New Textures. And I'm going to save this as the UFO main texture Photoshop file. Okay. We can now hop into Photoshop and open up that file. So let's hop in there. There it is, New Textures, UFO main texture. And now in Photoshop, I have my background and my UV mesh layer. Okay, so any layers you see in body paint, you can see in Photoshop. And there are some exceptions where you can't go back and forth, but a lot of Photoshop features will translate perfectly right back into Cinema 4D. Cool. So one thing that might be helpful too, because I can sort of tell where some of the boundaries are here, but I can't see my 3D model like I can here, right? And so if I want to know exactly, let's say that I know I want to put a ring around this edge, right, of the model, what I might do is make a new layer. Let's see, it's this button, this leftmost button. Makes a new layer, and I'm going to call this ring reference. And I'll just grab my paintbrush, make it a little smaller, and I will just very quickly draw a ring, right on the model. And that way I can say, okay, I know I'm going to want a ring right there. I can turn off my UV mesh layer, and you can see that it's creating sort of a ring like that. And, this can be very, 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 very rough. But this is going to now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save my texture. I'm going to go up to File and say Save Texture. So now I'll go back into Photoshop, and I'll close the texture, don't save it, and I'll just reopen it. And now I've got that reference layer, okay? And I can line it up with my UV mesh layer. And so now, if I wanted to, by the way, I just faded that back by hitting 2 on my keyboard. It's a neat little way to quickly change the opacity of your layer. And let me lock my UV mesh layer. So now I can see exactly where on the UV mesh that ring needs to be. Okay. Another thing I like to do, because this is a symmetrical texture, is I'm gonna make sure my ruler's open, Command R if it's not, and I'm just gonna click and drag a guide and stick one right in the middle there and one right in the middle there. What that's gonna let me do is let me grab like this ellipse tool, and now I can line this up just like this right in the middle, and hold Option and Shift, and now I could make a ring right exactly where I want it. And let's turn that stroke, the fill off, and give it a stroke. We could just make the stroke, doesn't matter. Let's make it like dark blue or something, 10 pixels. Okay, and there you go. And so now I've got an ellipse right perfectly centered on my UV map, right where I want it. And now I'm fairly sure, we could actually try this, but I don't believe body paint can read an ellipse layer. Here's how we check it. We save our Photoshop file, Command S, hop back into Body Paint, and you just go up to File and say Revert Texture to Saved and say Yes, okay? And it will bring in the newest version of your Photoshop file. Now you can see, here's the ellipse layer, but it doesn't know what to do with it. All right, so in this case, what I'm gonna do is just take my ellipse layer, control click it, and say Rasterize. Now save this, go back into Body Paint, File, Revert Texture to Save, and now, look at that. There is my blue ring right on that edge, exactly where I wanted it. Very cool, okay? So this just gives you a taste of like the control you can get. Next thing is, I wanted a nice, rough, gritty, cool texture. Now, where do you get something like that? Well, one of my favorite websites is cgtextures.com, which has a free account you can sign up for, and there are tons of amazing textures. And so I went into metal, and I looked around at some of the textures, and let me actually use a different texture this time so we can get a little bit of a different result. Maybe something like this or something like this. I just wanted something a little bit grungy and rough, right? And what you can do, what's really cool, is a lot of times you can look at these and you can see if they are tileable. Tileable means you can loop them and make them seamless and make the textures bigger or smaller. And that's actually what I want to do. So let me find something that says set tiled. Why don't we try this? Here we go, okay? And so now I can download this image for free. If you get a premium membership, you can get higher res versions of it, but I'll just use the small one for now. So I'm gonna download this, okay? And then I'm just gonna grab my download, bring it right into Photoshop, okay? And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this texture and I'm just gonna hold Option and copy it, and I'm just gonna keep lining it up, just like this. I'm making a giant patch of that texture. Then I'm gonna select all 4 of these layers, hit Command E, that'll combine them all, and then I can do the same thing here. And you can see how quickly, with that seamless texture, you can just build these things up. cgtextures.com, people, it's amazing. Cool, all right, and so now I'm gonna save a copy. I'm gonna call this Metal Original. I don't wanna manipulate this copy. I wanna keep a copy of that. So I'm gonna turn that copy off, and then this is gonna be the basis for my color channel. So I'm gonna say color base, and I want it to be really dark, all right? I want it to be pretty dark, but I kind of want to see a little bit of detail in there, maybe something like that. And then I'm gonna open my color balance. By the way, I did that really fast. That was the levels effect. Command L brings that up. And then I'm gonna do Command B for color balance, and I'm gonna push a little teal into the midtones, not too much. And then in the shadows, I'm gonna pull some of the blue out because it's so blue, and I'm trying to neutralize it a little bit. I could desaturate it, but I do like having some color in there. That's kind of interesting. All right, so let's say okay. Now let's bring that color base down here. We've got our blue ellipse, which I don't really want to be blue. So I'm gonna hit Command U to bring up hue and saturation. And I'm gonna desaturate it, and I'm gonna bring the lightness up so it's more of a grayish color. And then I'm gonna hit save. Now let's go back into Cinema 4D. And let's go up to File, Revert Texture to Saved. And now you can see sometimes you get redraw issues. Just zoom in and out really quickly. You can now see our textures come in, and this is what it looks like. It's being put onto our UFO. Okay, now here's a good time to talk about scale. Look at the scale of the texture, okay? It's too big. I can see too much, I can see like too much detail in it from this, and it should feel further away, and it doesn't. So, easy fix. Back into Photoshop, take our color base, shrink it down really small, like that, okay? And then let's do the same thing. Let's copy it. The new Photoshop has these amazing built-in like smart guides, which makes it a lot easier to do this, a lot quicker. And then I can just select all those, hit Command E to combine them, and then just copy one more time. Cool. All right, so here's my new color base. All right, save that. Go back into Cinema 4D, Revert Texture to Saved. And there we go. Cool. And now when we render it, there's a lot more detail in there, okay? So that's working better for me. All right, so now let's talk about some of the other things that we need to do. So first off, I want to have some detail in this, okay? And so I'm going to bring my UV mesh layer up to the top here and turn it on so I can actually see where the polygons are. All right, so this ellipse here, I want to create sort of a series of those ellipses. So I'm going to grab my ellipse tool and I'm going to click in the middle and hold Option and Shift. And I'm just going to sort of line them up with various edges. Okay, so I'm going to turn the fill off. I'm going to turn the stroke on. I'll just use white. And let's not make them too thick. Actually, I'm going to delete the original ellipse because it's too thick. So I have an ellipse with a 3-pixel stroke on it. And now what I can do is I can turn these guides off temporarily. Command semicolon is the hotkey. And I'm going to duplicate the ellipse. And then I'm going to shrink the copy down. And let's put one copy. See these dense areas here, right here? That's where we added the bevel. And so this inner part, this is actually the inset part of the spaceship, right? So maybe we'll make that another color. That would actually be cool. So I'm going to keep copying these ellipses. And I just kind of want to sprinkle them around, but I want them to line up on edges so it does look deliberate, okay? And let's do one more, and we'll do it on this edge there. Okay, now this is that inner part of that spaceship, right? Between this thick edge and this thick edge. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make another ellipse, I'm gonna transform it, and I'm gonna stick it right in the middle of that, just like that. That's not enough. Let's scale it up a little bit more. There we go, right in the middle like that. And then I'm going to increase the stroke until it fills that area. And it's actually putting the stroke inside, so I'm going to line it up on the outside. And then let's make that like 35 and see. Yeah, there we go. Okay, and so this is my inner color. So whatever color I make this, that's what's going to be inside this little groove right there. So why don't I make that like a, some neat blue color, right? And then we're going to color correct this heavily in After Effects anyway. So now remember, Cinema 4D does not read these ellipses. So what you can do is take them all, put them inside a folder like this, call this ellipse group, and that way you always have a copy of them. Then you can just copy that whole group, turn the group off, select the folder, and hit Command E, and that will rasterize it. Let's turn off the UV mesh layer and hit Save. And then, we could even adjust the opacity of this. We could maybe make the opacity 80%, right? I just did that by switching to my arrow tool and hitting 8 on the number pad, so we can see through this a little bit. All right, and if we go into Cinema 4D now and we say Revert Texture to Saved, okay, now all of those rings, all of that detail is coming through. We have total control over everything. Cool. Another thing that I wanted on this UFO was I wanted a ton of little kind of architectural looking details, and I knew that was going to be tricky to do. So what I did was I actually just got on Google Images and I just sort of looked for some geometric patterns, right? And I didn't want stuff that was obviously a pattern. So what I ended up doing was getting on Pinterest, and I found a bunch of stuff kind of like this. Let me actually see here. Pinterest is another, Michael Frederick, good friend of mine. The Pinterest is a great place to find stuff like this. You can search for geometric, right? And it's going to show you a whole bunch of reference, and you can be like, oh, that's cool. Let me grab something like that. Or actually maybe I want to try and do something different with you guys than I did on the demo, just to show you kind of the techniques involved, right? Something like this, right? What if I could grab like that interesting pattern, and so let's see if we can. Let's actually open Photoshop and just pull that right in. And I'm going to desaturate it. That's Shift Command U, by the way. And I'm going to try and just crush the levels here so I can get just that pattern out of there. Okay, that's kind of interesting. I'm going to solo this layer. I'm going to hold Option and click on the eyeball. And I need to put a black shape underneath it. There we go. And that needs to be at 100% opacity. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this black and white image here, and I'm going to attempt to copy it and flip it horizontal, and line it up like this and see if we can get some kind of symmetrical shape out of it. Let's see. There we go. Right? And then I'm going to combine those, and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm just holding Option and dragging it, and then I'm going to flip it vertically like that. Right? And again, I want to come in. I want to make sure this is symmetrical. That's great. Okay, cool. And then I'm going to combine those. And now, because we're getting this feathering on the edge, this part's going to be a little trickier. But why don't I move this to the top and do another copy like this. And I think it's actually going to be okay. I mean, it's kind of fading out a little bit, but that might be fine. Let's combine these. And so this is just kind of the quick and dirty way to just take a texture that's not really big enough to tile the way you want, and just keep copying it and flipping it and mirroring it and create what you want. Cool? And then maybe, let's kind of center this thing here. All right, and I know I'm doing this fast, but this would be a 4-hour tutorial if I wasn't. And now I'm gonna copy it, and I'm gonna rotate it 90 degrees. And then I'm gonna set it to screen. So now we get this crazy kind of doubling effect. And maybe that copy, right, the copy that I just switched 90 degrees, I could shrink it down a little bit, right? So we can sort of have multiple layers. Sorry about that. We can have multiple layers of this texture. Here we go. And combine those, set that back to screen. Actually, first let me just go ahead and copy it like that, set that to screen, and maybe set the opacity back a little bit. And so now you're just getting all this detail that's just so fine. There's tons of stuff. Okay, and let's turn that off for a second, and let's turn on our color base. Turn that back on, and we've got our ellipse group copy here, which I believe I've actually somehow messed up. So let me delete that and make a copy of my ellipse group again, turn it on, and hit Command E. And then we've now got these two new layers, which I'm going to just combine those and set it to screen, right? And I'm going to turn the opacity down a little bit, and you can see now I've got all this crazy geometric funky detail on there. Let me rotate it a little bit too, so it's not like perfectly lined up. Okay. There you go. Cool. And I can scale it down because it's only going to show up within that circle. Right, so I can make it even finer. Like that. There we go. Cool. And let's save that. Let's go into Cinema 4D and revert our texture. Okay, and now you can see you're getting all this crazy stuff on there, and it's too big. See, it's crazy. It looks like the scale is good, and then you look at it on the object and you're like, yeah, it's too big. But that's an easy fix. Let me hit undo so I can get rid of that rotation, and let's just scale this thing way down again. Okay. And we're just going to do the same thing. We're just going to make a copy, and we're going to tile it, right? And we'll put this like this, make another copy, flip this one vertically. Cool. And then merge this and make sure that we've scaled it big enough so that we can actually cover the entire UFO, set it to screen, save that, hop back into Cinema 4D, and revert our texture to saved. And now you're getting a ton of detail in there. Cool? All right, so what I did was I sort of had multiple levels of this. I'll actually open up the texture so you guys can see. This was actually the texture I created. You see I had some geometric patterns. Oh, here's another thing I did. There's so many little tricks. I took a circuit board image and I ran the filter polar coordinates on it to make it kind of spherify or circleify. To get that. Oh, here's another cool thing I'll show you guys. I made a new layer, and I'll just call this rust, and I'm going to set it to color. I'm going to set it to color burn, and I'm going to pick like some kind of orangey color. And what this is going to let you do is paint on this layer, and you can see I've already got kind of a goofy brush here. You can grab like a kind of a rusty, grungy brush and turn on your UV mesh layer. And this is going to let you see where the edges are. And you can just sort of paint like a grunge kind of right onto it, right? And this is a lot easier if you have a Wacom stylus or a Cintiq or something like that, because you can literally just sketch, like, you know, and kind of build up a layer of rust right around edges, right? Because that's generally where rust is going to form. It's going to form on the edges of things, right? And so while I'm at it, let me take this ellipse group and let me tone it way down, and then I'm going to make a copy of it, and I'm going to blur the copy just because it's feeling a little too harsh for me right now. I'm going to set the copy to screen. All right, I'm going to come back up to my rust layer, and I'm just going to paint a little bit of rust. I'm doing this really quickly because this tutorial is already so long, and there's still a couple other things we have to get to. All right, so, you know, this is the idea. You take a brush and you paint these rust strokes right on it, okay? By the way, you can do this inside of Cinema 4D too, but I just like the brushes in Photoshop better. All right, and then if you want, you can lower the opacity of the rust so it's not so dark. Let's try 70%. Save our texture, go back to Cinema 4D and say File, Revert Texture to Saved, right? And now you've got your rust layer, and if you look on here, you can see you get these nice little patches of rust, okay? So this would take some tweaking. I think the geometric stuff's a little heavy, you know. I really would want to probably dial that back so it's not nearly as intense. But now, let's revert that real quick. So now I want to talk about the next steps, all right? Because now you sort of know the workflow, how you build up a texture and how you can get it to look the way you want. But it still looks so smooth and crappy. And so we need to move on to lighting, okay? Lighting is very important. Now, an easy way to sort of preview this, I'm going to go to startup mode for a minute. An easy way to sort of test your lighting is to use two lights, all right? This is specifically for a UFO. If this thing is a UFO and it's floating outside, you've really got a couple of things lighting it. You've got the sky, right? Which would be, and we can make it just an area light, and let me rotate it. I'm gonna hit Command D to bring up my, there we go. Bring up our axis, all right? So you've got an area light, negative 90 degrees above it, right? And this is going to light the top of it, right? These top edges. But then light's going to bounce off of the ground and go back up onto the UFO. All right, so there's going to be another one below the UFO. So let's take that light, move it down like this, right? And flip it around. And so now you get something like this, okay? And you can start to visualize a little bit what this is going to look like. The light that's on the top is going to be much brighter than the lights that's on the bottom, and it may even have like a little bluish tint if you wanted to preview that. You could set your light to have the tint. And you know, there are going to be shadows and ambient occlusion, so we could turn on our ambient occlusion effect, which is going to help us see what it's going to look like inside, you know, our nice little grooves and things like that. And so, you know, but I knew going in that I wanted this to look very real, and I needed it to sort of match my footage, right? So first off, let me grab a background here, and I'm going to make a new texture, and in the color channel, I'm going to load in, let's see here. This is just a JPEG that I grabbed off of the video, right? And it looks crunched because I don't have my my project set up correctly. So let's set that to 1920 by 1080. All right, so this is just a shot from the actual footage. And so what this let me do is sort of get my camera oriented correctly so that this would look right. You know, because if I couldn't look at the scene, maybe I would have done it like this, right? And now it kind of looks like the UFO is tilted, you know, and so maybe, you know, but that's too flat. So I sort of used my, my image as a reference to really make it easier to position this thing. Once I had it where I liked, I zoomed in like this and rendered that, so I knew I could shrink it down. But I used that, And I also wanted to have an image light this thing, right? Instead of actually using lights like this, you can use an image to do it. One of the cool things that comes with Cinema 4D is the content browser. So if you hit Shift F8, it'll bring up your content browser. And I have the studio version of Cinema 4D. I'm sure most of you do too. But there's all these other folders in there. And one of them is Visualize. All right. And you've got materials in there and HDRI materials. There's also a Prime folder, which has a materials folder in it, and HDRI folder, and there's all these HDRI image maps in there, and these are literally spherical maps. So what I did was I just looked around for an image that I thought was close enough to my neighborhood, right? Blue skies, some clouds, trees, green grass and trees, that kind of stuff. Right, so something like this maybe. This might work. So how do you actually take this image and light your scene with it? Well, you can just drag this material right in, and then I'm going to add a sky, and I'm going to turn off my background. I don't need it anymore. And I'm going to take this HDRI material and put it on the sky. Okay, and now if I hit render, you will see that I can see my HDRI image. It's very pixelated. It's not lighting anything. If you want it to light this, you have to turn on global illumination. Okay? Global illumination will let your textures light things in your scene. Okay? And so now you can see that this thing is being lit way more from the top. And actually, let me turn these two lights off that I have in my scene so you can see just the lighting from the scene. Okay? Cool. Now, it's not very bright lighting in the scene. And so if I want to increase that, what I can do is go to my global illumination settings and up the gamma. All right, and then that's going to give more influence to the lights from my image that we're using on the sky. And I also don't want to render the sky. I just want to use it to light this. So the other thing you can do is right-click on sky or control-click or whatever, Cinema 4D tags, compositing tag, and set this to not be seen by camera. Just uncheck that. And now you can still use it to light your scene, right? And it will still light it perfectly. You just will not actually see it in the render. There you go. So now with all of that done, let's turn on our greebles. Let's turn those back on. All right, just in the render, not in the viewer. And I'm just going to copy my texture right onto the cloner. And I know that the texture is not going to line up perfectly with it, but that's okay, right? Because really, we're not supposed to really be able to see those greebles. I just want them to be there to break up the image and give it some more detail. And now you can see, if I turn my background on especially, and do another render, you can see that those greebles, they do a really good job of adding just a bunch of visual kind of variation to that UFO. And because our texture has so much detail to it, this thing is really starting to look big, okay? So a few other things I did. This tutorial is already super long, but hopefully you guys are just learning a ton. Obviously, you would need to do a UV map for the inside, texture map it, and do all the same things, right? And just to make this go a little bit faster, what I'm actually going to do is open up my final UFO here, and I'm going to show you guys some things on this scene. Okay, so this is set up the same way. We've got a sky with an HDRI on it, and we've got the same kind of deal. We've got greebles and textures. Now here's the big difference. Okay, the big difference is these materials that are on the UFO are not just color materials, right? We also have diffusion, reflection, and bump. Okay, and so let me turn off reflection and bump and diffusion for a minute. Okay, and let me turn off all the pieces that I don't need you to see right now. Let's turn that off and turn this off, and we'll turn the greebles off. And let me just do a quick render of this, and you can see it. Okay. Let me zoom in on this. So if we go like this, right, you'll see, okay, here's our texture. It's nice and smooth, right? But I have also created textures for the bump map, right, And it's literally just a copy of the color channel with a few differences. And I'll show you what those differences are. And also a displacement map, which is identical to the bump map. And so we've got bump, sorry, not displacement, diffusion. There we go, identical to the bump map. All right, and so now when we render this, and actually let me turn reflection back on too, because I did have a reflection channel with Fresnel in it. Okay, and what this is going to do is it's going to give our surface some variation in lighting too. It's going to give it a little bit of a grungier look. And so let's go back here, right? And I'll show you how this is going to work on this model. So what I would do is I would go back into Photoshop and I would say, okay, I need a bump map and I want it to match up with our color map, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this color base layer and just move it up to the top here. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to use levels to get as much contrast out of it as I can. And I'm going to desaturate it. Cool. All right, so that's a good high contrast bump map. I'm now going to save this. I'm going to hit Shift Command S to save as, and I'm going to save this as a UFO bump texture. Okay, and I don't need to save the layers here. I'm just going to save it as a copy. So now I'll go back into Cinema 4D. All right, and before I do that, I want to make sure that I turn that layer off so that it's not covering up our color channel. Okay, so now I'm going to go into my UFO material, which is this material, and I should probably name this. This is UFO 01, and I'm going to add a bump channel, a diffusion channel, and a reflection channel. Let's go into the diffusion channel first, and the texture is going to be that file I just made. Okay, so that's going to be our UFO bump Photoshop file, and then I'm going to copy that channel and go into bump and paste it. And then I'm going to go into reflection and I'm going to add Fresnel to the texture. I'm going to mix it as a multiply and set it to 50%. Setting it to multiply basically lets you use this brightness value here to be the overall brightness of your reflection, and then this Fresnel can only subtract from it. It can't increase it. If you have it set to normal, it's going to totally override this. And I don't want it to be totally reflective, okay? I just want it to be somewhat reflective. And so now you can see there's a lot more. It's almost like a little bit shiny up there, which is pretty cool. That bump map and the diffusion map, it really gives it a lot of nice kind of contrast and detail, surface detail, which can make it look bigger. All right, so the diffusion, you can see how dark it's getting. That's because my diffusion is a little strong. So I'm going to turn down the mix strength here, and you can see that our preview, it shows you it gets a little bit brighter, right? And then the bump, the strength is 20. I'm going to leave it at that. I also noticed it was very shiny up here. That might be reflection. So let me just turn the reflection down to 20, because that might have actually been the reflection of the clouds in the UFO. Here we go. This is working better, okay? And you can see because I used an HDR image on a sky to light this, it really does kind of feel like it sits in the scene. Now, it's way too dark. It hasn't been composited. And obviously this part here has no texture on it yet. But you can see how we've built up this object. It looks very detailed with the greebles and the fine texture. And now it's got this nice bump map, and you can see the contours kind of show you that this is a huge, massive thing. And so this is the process I used to get to this, okay? Exact same process. And so now let's turn all this stuff back on. Let's turn this on, turn our UFO greebles on, and I'll do a render of this. And while we're waiting, I want to tell you that before I end the tutorial, there is going to be a couple other things I'm going to tell you, okay? Now, I knew I was going to be compositing this in After Effects, and I knew that one of the cues that helps you tell that things are big is by having closer parts of that thing look different than further parts of that thing. I hope that made sense. I basically wanted a way to be able to composite the depth of this thing inside of After Effects. So what I did was I added a camera, and I went to my top view here, right? And what I did was I set the focus distance of my camera to right before the object, right? See how it's right before that? And then I turned on the rear blur, and I set the end value there, right? And you can see if I move it, it changes where this plane is here, right? I set the end to the very back of that UFO. And so then what that let me do is it let me create a depth map. And I'll show you what that looks like. I'm going to turn off save for a minute. I enabled in my multipass settings, I enabled depth, which is already in there, which is why you don't see it. And what this depth pass does, let me set it to current frame. And let me just set this down to 960 by 540 also. I'll do a quick render. So the depth pass gives you a black and white image where things that are close, and as it starts to render, you'll see things that are close are black and things that are far are white, okay? And you have to set up the depth pass correctly with your camera settings. But now that I've done that, you can see I also have a multi-pass here, like a render pass, where I could now color correct the UFO so that the back of it is different than the front of it. And that's a good way to help sell the size of it. Okay, so this is the render. This is the depth pass. Here's the alpha channel, right? And all I did animation-wise was I just slowly, and the animation doesn't play very quickly because I've got all of these layers turned on, right? But if I turn all of these things off, there we go. It's still going to be very, very slow. All I'm doing is rotating this very, very slowly. There's not a lot of animation. It's just barely turning. And the idea was to have it just turn very slowly. Here, I can show you on this one. Right? I didn't want it to turn like this, right? Because then it's like, oh my God, that enormous thing is spinning so fast that doesn't make sense. If it's really a gigantic city-sized spaceship, it should be turning like very slowly, very, very slowly. So just a little bit of rotation on there, a depth pass, and one last trick, because now I noticed it. If you notice, right? Let me go to the picture viewer here. If you notice in our render, this stuff is glowing. We've got lights on there, right? How cool. So one of the things I did was on those little speakers that I modeled on these, there's a light, all right? So we could do the same thing on ours. Remember, we modeled these speakers, right? And we put them, let me turn those on. There we go. We've got these speakers here. So what I could do is just take a light, parent it to the speaker, zero it out, and then let's push that light. Let's figure it out. Here we go. Push that light out. There we go. And we'll turn on fall off on all of those lights. And we don't need a lot. We don't need enormous fall off like that. We need a little bit of fall off. There we go. And then let's make those lights, I don't know, some kind of alien teal color, right? And then let's render that. And you can see now you're going to get lighting on each of those little speakers. All right, so that was one thing I did, and I probably cranked it up so it looked a lot brighter. Right, so let's set that to like 300. But then on top of that, I wanted kind of a glow underneath this thing too. So here's a really cool lighting trick you can do with stuff like this. I'm gonna make a spline, like a circle spline, put it on the XZ plane, and let's move it down so we can actually see it. There we go. And I'm gonna scale it so it's about the size of the inside, right? The inside of the little speaker cone here. Then I'm going to add an area light, and I'm going to call this circle light. And what I'm going to do is go to details, and where it says area shape, switch that from rectangle to object spline and drag your spline in there. That will let that spline actually be a light emitting object. So now I can change these settings, and I could, maybe pick similar kind of alien color. And turn the brightness up, and I can turn fall off on, right, and set that to like a much smaller value, right? And now if we render that, you're going to see that the underside of this is going to have light hitting it too. Okay, so now we've got light here on the speakers, and we've also got light underneath it. And the light underneath isn't bright enough, and you're seeing some noise, which means there's not enough samples. So I'm going to have to up these samples too, and probably turn this way up so we can actually see it. And so that's what I did. I used a circle spline underneath, and I also had lights on each of these little speakers. And there you go. And now you can start to get that diffuse glow. And what would be really slick is if you duplicated this whole lighting setup and you took that circle spline and you made it even bigger, right? And you lined it up. Remember, we've got this cool, let me switch my display for a minute to quick shading. Remember, we've got this cool little groove that we modeled in there. Well, if you are really, really precise, you could put that circle spline in there. And it's going to be tricky to get it just right. But if you can just thread the needle and get that to actually go inside there, right? And now let's make sure this is set up. Circle light 1. Let's call this inner light. And it's looking at circle 1. And let's turn the fall off for a minute. All right. And now let's do a quick render of this, and you can see that now inside there you've got this glowing light because you've got that circle spline up in there. So using the spline to light pieces of your model is another cool way to kind of get that UFO glowing look. All right. And this is starting to look pretty sweet. All right. Woo, that was a long one. I might have to edit this thing. So, what did we go over? Let's recap real quick. We went over getting reference materials and how to utilize it in Cinema 4D. We went over a lot of modeling tools. We talked about using the body paint tools to get a good UV map, going back and forth with Photoshop to texture. We talked about setting up the depth pass, setting up image-based lighting, and talking about a little bit of rendering using the multi-passes to get a depth pass. Just so you guys know, I rendered, let me show you my render settings. I rendered this 1920 by 1080. I know I changed it in the middle of the demo, but it was 1920 by 1080. 24 frames a second. I did an OpenEXR 32-bit file with an alpha channel, and then the multipass file was also OpenEXR 32 bits. I set it to be a multi-layer file, so I didn't have a million files. I just had one multi-layered set of files. Turned on multipass with a depth pass. My anti-aliasing was set to best, so I had good reflections and all that stuff. And that was basically it. So my God, that was an absolute brain dump right there. I hope you guys learned a lot, and this is just part 1. Part 2 is where we're going to go into After Effects and talk about compositing this whole thing. So I want to thank you guys for sticking with this. I want to thank Premium Beat for asking me to make this video. And just so you guys know, all of the music and sound effects used in the demo were all straight from Premium Beat. I did not use any other outside sources. And if you guys like this, check out my site, schoolmotion.com. Thank you guys. I'll see you on part 2. I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you learned a lot, and please check out premiumbeat.com if you need stock music or sound effects. Super affordable, but super high quality. I can't recommend them enough. And if you like tutorials like this, please check out my site, schoolmotion.com, where there's a lot more content just like this. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next time.